Thank you, Robert, and thank you to the American University of Paris for having us here this evening. Welcome to Why Brands Should Be Paying Attention to France's Growing Podcast Scene, hosted by me, Lory Martinez. Just for a little bit of context, this session will be split into two sections. So the first half will be a little bit more of context. I'm going to be presenting what's been happening in the podcast scene in France. And then the second half will be a panel discussion with our lovely guests who are in the front row, Lauren Bastide from Nouvelles Écoutes, which is one of the first podcast studios in France, and Gregory Pouy from Plink Studio, which is one of the first branded podcast only studios in France, which is very interesting for our subject today. Also, since this is going to be rebroadcast on Sunday, International Podcast Day, we have a hashtag that if you wanted to interact during the session or even later on when it's rebroadcast, you can use the hashtag International Podcast Day France. So if you have any questions and if you want to continue the conversation after the session is over, you can go ahead and use that hashtag. So a little bit of background about me. As Robert said, I am an alumna of the American University of Paris. I have been working as a consultant and podcast producer since I graduated here. Before that, I worked in radio in New York. And when I finished my program at AUP, one of the first things that I did was work on a podcast. You might know her, Lindsay Tremuda. She's an alumnus of AUP. She started a podcast called The New Paris, and I worked on the first few episodes of her show. And it was the first time that I realized the potential for podcasting in France. At the time, it wasn't a thing. People were, kind of wondering what it was. And since then, I've seen the market grow. And I have a little bit of background with both the UK, the US, and the French markets, so I'm going to be able to compare a little bit when I'm giving you this explanation here. I've been working on a few different shows. Dinner for One is a podcast about getting over a breakup one meal at a time. It's in English, so if you want to check it out. You also have À Poil, which is a gastronomy podcast with Julie Gerbet, which is a journalist from Le Fooding. And we interview chefs about their passions and what's behind their favorite dishes. And then we have Ex-Expat podcast with journalist Marjorie Murphy. She's a former journalist from Radio Canada, who I'm very happy to work with on this project, which is an investigation of what it's like to come back to France after living abroad, which is, short answer, not easy. Long answer, listen to the show. And aside from that, I work as a consultant on different podcasts for institutions and for brands and influencers. All right, so what is happening with the podcast in France? As an Anglophone in Paris, I have quite a unique perspective because I did see how my colleagues at NPR kind of embraced the podcast boom back in 2015 with Serial. And since then, I've been kind of frustrated when I first got here because there was nothing really happening with podcasts. And one of the first things I heard was La Poudre, which is the first podcast in France that was getting attention. And it's hosted by our guest, Lauren Bastide, and she'll tell us about it. But at the time, nothing was really going on because it wasn't really seen as a serious medium. And you had to kind of have this conversation about what is a podcast. And it's very particular to France because there's this relationship with Radio France, which is very particular, but we'll get into that. What is to say that over the past 3 years, I've seen that there's been a real investment happening in the podcast scene in France. So this was podcasting in 2016. You have these headlines that are talking about podcasts as a new way to listen to radio. It's really kind of reinvention of audio on demand. People are really thinking, oh, podcasts, they're a thing. Because maybe people they've heard listen to podcasts in the US. You have friends that are listening to Serial. You have francophones who are actually listening to things that are happening in the US. So still a good time to start a podcast studio, right? Even though you still have to explain to a lot of people what is a podcast. Flash forward to now, and it's being seen as an El Dorado by France Culture. You have L'Express, which is talking about brands and listeners who are addicted to podcasts today. And you also have different trends. You have sex podcasts that are coming out. You have food podcasts that are coming out, all touching subjects that weren't necessarily being focused on in the same way by traditional media. And so how did we get here? It's kind of similar to the way that podcasts kind of grew in the US, which is you have to have this one thing that creates this this attention for it. But in France, it's more like a wave of different shows and a different studios. And it's largely in part because of the studios that this is happening. But in France, there's something really particular. And when I came here, it was one of the first things that I noticed, because what's a podcast in France? Here's a little cartoon. And it kind of illustrates the biggest, complication with podcasts is that in France, Radio France, which is NPR of France, they've been producing shows and rebroadcasting them online and calling them podcasts. And they're actually just replays of their radio programs, but they're called podcasts. So when podcasts, as we know them as Anglophones, came to France, they had to kind of find a new name for them. And so you have to have this conversation where you're describing, like, okay, well, is this a podcast or is it podcast natif? So, and then when the radio station itself wants to do a podcast, they call it a podcast original. So they have to create this whole like vocabulary that didn't need to exist really if they had called it something else. But that's one part of it. Another part that's really interesting about podcasting in France is that it's seen as kind of this, at first, I mean, this is an older cartoon, but it was at first seen kind of as an amateur thing, something for young people to talk about niche subjects, like your skate and literature podcast that this young kid is listening to. And then Rire et Chanson is a very traditional French podcast from Radio France. And so it's like the older audience that you have listening to this. But what's great is that France has the biggest radio listening audience of most of the European countries. And so you have an audience that's ready to listen to on-demand audio all the time. And so when you're trying to sell a podcast in France, it's actually really easy because people already listen to them regularly. They just don't know it. And so there was this really big pedagogy that had to be made by the big independent studios that launched when they started explaining this to their clients. And so who are the studios? So this is actually great because they all kind of launched in the last few years. I think the earliest one was maybe Boxon. Correct me if I'm wrong. No. Binge was the first one. Binge, which is launched also by former people of Radio France. And what's great here is that a lot of these people, all of these studios are, one, run by former journalists. So you have some really great editorial guidance with the programs that are being launched. And two, a lot of them are run by women, which is not something that we see in other markets. What's crazy is that in the UK and in the US, where the podcast market is huge listener numbers that are in the millions for even the most independent shows, in France, all the shows are being run by women. And from producers to hosts to studios themselves, most of these studios have female founders or co-founders. And it's really great to see because you don't have the same question of diversity. You already have it. So to go into each one, Nouvelles Écoutes is founded by one of our guests, Lauren Bastide, and her co-founder. And then we have Louis Media, which is Melissa Benoit and Charlotte Podlowski, formerly of Slate, so another journalistic background. You have Binge, who are from Radio France. Boxon also has a really big team from Radio France. Mukashi is one of the independent studios that I did include here because, again, it's a female founder, tiny studio that really just wants to tell stories, not necessarily aiming to become a commercial kind of thing yet. And again, founded by someone who is an independent journalist who's working with her friend who's a producer. So it's a great atmosphere to be at. And the final one, Plink, which is two male founders. Plink, which is Gregory Prui's project, and he's going to tell us about that, but it's one of the first that is only brand. And that is a really big deal because in France, you weren't able to sell anything in podcasts earlier. If you flash back to 2 years ago, you still had to have the conversation, what's a podcast? And now you have branded podcasts coming out of all of these studios, from Chanel to Madame Figaro to maybe soon Instagram. We don't know. But we'll hear about that from our guest later. One of the things that I've noticed when I started working here in podcasts was that the ecosystem of podcast wasn't really developed in a way for, even when it comes to like hosting. You host your podcast online. iTunes in France exists, but when it comes to publishing, sharing or marketing your show, nothing really existed in French. And so when the podcast boom in France happened, you had all these little businesses that sprouted up. So we have a dedicated media, Radio Tips, which is also an independent one started by a journalist in France. And then you also have Eco Podcast, which is a way to find French podcasts. little app. You have Osha, which recently launched, and some of these are even just Osha's launched maybe like July of this year. So they're all brand new, and they're kind of answering the need that's being brought about by this boom, which is, well, what happens when a French podcaster wants to go and publish a podcast? They have to go to Libsyn or Blueberry, and it's all in English. And so even though some of them have nuances of English, it's not their native language, and it's not as easy to kind of share your project when it's not your language. So these are answering those questions. Osha allows podcasters to go into a marketplace where they can sell their podcasts as well. Pippa, which was started by someone who actually went to the States and learned what was happening with podcasts and then came back and then created the startup, which allows people to host their podcasts, used by a lot of different people in the market, and so on. And Podcast.io is another one, which is something that's really great because in France, the podcast community is small one, but it's one where we support each other. And so Podcast.io is one of the biggest examples of that. It's an independent network of producers and creators who inspire each other and aren't necessarily just looking to sell their story. They're just working together. And so you have really great things coming out of their network that are completely independently done. Someone who loves medieval history can create a podcast because they're part of that, and they can share it. They also have a ranking, which is interesting if you're looking to find out what's going on with other podcasts that aren't necessarily listed in iTunes for independent shows. Now, so what are the kinds of shows that are happening here? I am a producer, and so I kind of understand different kinds of formats that are being used in different markets. What's very popular in the US is storytelling, the narration format. But in France, what's really popular is this kind of radio interview, and in a confessional format. So the confessional format interview has been very popular here in France. Some of my favorites, and I think I want to feature these particularly because they are very unique and also demonstrative of what's happening here. Me, My, Sex, and I, which is a podcast about Black female woman experience in France, what it's like to be here, another confessional format style, and one of the first shows to do this, and kind of answering this question about diversity and women in journalism. This kind of person would not have been able to create some kind of article or blog or something like that and have the same intimacy that they have with this podcast format. And so what you have is this kind of ecosystem of formats like this. So Me, My, Sex, and I is very popular. You also have Nouvelle École, which shows, which is one of the interesting case studies that I like to look at, because it's a podcast where there's this young man. He's kind of looking for his path in life. He's a millennial. He doesn't know what he wants to do. And so he decides to ask famous people how they got to where they got and how they figured it out. And it's honest and true and young and, naive, and it's questioning of this kind of questions of life. And he asks, influencers and people he admires to answer questions. And it's one of the first independent podcasts not supported by a studio to make it to the top of the iTunes listing. And it was a big day for podcasts in France because it was interesting to see how this person who was all alone got to this far. But it just goes to show how this kind of, confessional format can really draw people in and create an intimacy that doesn't exist with other formats. You also have Louis Media, who produces narrative style podcasts, and they have this show called Entre, which is about going from a young girl to a teen and kind of leaving behind your doudou and your baby stuff to go into become a woman. And it's a very interesting take on transition into womanhood. La Poudre, which is a wonderful show about being a woman and how to become a woman and what it's like, also in an interview kind of format. And these questions are questions that were not able to be asked in the same kind of context in a regular media publication. You have Chiffon, which is fashion-based, again, question interview formats. Bliss Stories, which focuses on maternity. You have Entre nos lèvres, which is a confessional format, but really a great story where, these two young girls, they were having conversations about sex and they felt like, well, what if other people were interested in what we're, dealing with? We're all dealing with the same problem. So this communitarian aspect is coming up. And so they're bringing together people through their experiences. You're not alone is basically the gist of this whole podcast scene in France. You're not alone in your experience about sex. You're not alone in your maternal experience. You're not alone in your, experienced as a Black woman. You're not, other people are feeling the same way, and it feels like they're answering questions that weren't answered before. And we have Vlen, which is a marketing podcast by our special guest, Gregory Pui, and he'll tell us about his show. But in general, just to say that even though these are very feminine, some of these are very feminine stories and feminine focused, it is interesting to see that these are all female-led shows. A lot of them are female-led shows produced by women, telling stories that aren't necessarily being heard in other spaces. Radio France is not doing the same kind of shows. And today, when you look in the iTunes top 10, it's not necessarily just radio shows. It is independent shows coming out of this. And you have something like Bliss Stories coming up in the first listing. So that's really great to see. And what is the real numbers for this kind of market? When you're looking at podcasts in France, you have to consider that the population is way smaller than a market like in the US. We have 65 million in France versus 300 million in the US. So when you think about it, in terms of people who have heard a podcast, the number is actually really high. An OpinionWay study in 2017 showed that 39% of French people have already listened to a podcast, and that means audio on demand. That could be a Radio France podcast, that could be a podcast from an independent studio. But it definitely means that people are listening, and they know what they like, and they have more options now, not just your Radio France programs. You have something way more broad and touching on subjects that weren't being seen before. And then you also have this interesting statistic about time spent. And so, your average listening time is 30 minutes for a program. But in France, actually, one of the really interesting things is that a lot of the shows are longer than that. Some of them are over 45 minutes, which is not something that you see in the US, actually. And there's a reason for it, because, this kind of confessional format kind of brings you back. And so some of the habits, at least even for the podcasts that I've worked on, the listener habits are they'll listen to 80% and then they'll pick back up later. And that's great because you can accompany someone in their whole day, lunch break, trip home, and you're jogging. And also something else that's really great is that 29% of auditors of the podcast, auditeurs, listeners, really feel immersed in the content. And I think it also has a lot to do with the format that's very popular here, which is the interview style. In the US, you have this kind of amateur question of, two friends, let's make a podcast. Here, it's very much like, I really want to find out what you want to say about yourself. I want to find the deepest questions that you would never answer. Here is the format for it. And talk about subjects that you're interested in and passionate about. So there's a different, angle in attacking the podcast audio format. And finally, what we're going to be talking about for this next section is going to be everything to do with branded podcasts. Now, branded podcast means a podcast that is created for a brand and not necessarily something that is sponsored by a brand, because you can have a podcast that is produced independently and then that has a sponsored post in it. So I want to be clear, branded podcast is really referring to a podcast that is created for a brand to share brand messages, tell brand stories, and really create a love for the brand and create a kind of closeness with listeners and customers. So some of the interesting things that have been happening in the branded podcast scene here are podcasts that are produced by the independent studios. So you have 355, which is the Chanel podcast. It's a podcast about creativity and interviews with artists that have been collaborating with Chanel. You also have Dans la tête des femmes, which is a collaboration with Guerlain, which also sponsors other podcasts, but has created this dedicated podcast with My Little Paris. And it's about what's in a woman's mind when she is going on her way to her date. And it's a really beautiful narrative fiction podcast, but it shows that there are a lot of opportunities here. And you also have Elle Magazine and Grazia Magazine and Madame Figaro, all of different magazines and women's journalistic spaces. They're all investing in podcasts as well. You also have Birchbox, which invested in Regard, which is interviews with women about how they see themselves. You also have Veuve Clicquot, which actually launched this one in English, but it's about the history of the brand and telling stories about how they started. Le Gratin is actually an interesting one because it's an entrepreneur who had a brand and she wanted to tell the story of her brand, so she created a podcast. And what we're seeing is really, I mean, there are a lot of female-oriented brands that are already investing in this, but you also have Universal Studios France, which for the first time started seeing podcasts in France as a serious thing and actually used it to promote their film, which is a really fascinating way of telling a story, even outside of your own like general content that you're creating. This is kind of a multiplication of that content using podcasts. So that's really great. And so now we're going to take a little bit of a break. We're doing #International Day France. If you have questions or comments, you can comment in the time it takes for us to set up for our next session. I'm going to welcome my guests. Okay, welcome back to International Podcast Day France. So we're going to be passing on to this session with our special guests, Gregory Pouy and Lauren Bastide. So let's give the world a view of your studios, because each of you has a very unique vision of podcasting. And since you've recently launched, Gregory, and also you've been in this for a long time, as one can say. I really want to know what your different visions are of podcasting in France. So give us a little bit of an overview about your studios.
Thank you, Gregory, and thank you for inviting us, Lory. I guess the first idea behind Nouvelles Écoutes was really a journalistic quest. I was really frustrated as a journalist, especially as a woman journalist, after having worked for 10 years in a big fashion magazine called Elle. And after that, for 1 year on television, I felt that I didn't have enough space to do what I wanted to do as a journalist. And one of the things I wanted to do as a journalist was portraying women in a proper way that is not like a caricature, where women's words are not cut off or like changed or like stereotyped. And I used to listen to a lot of American podcasts. So yeah, I was a big fan of Here's the Thing with Alec Baldwin, actually. So he inspired me everything. And I was like, this is such an amazing way of interviewing people, because you just like, you put the microphone and you have the whole time in front of you. You don't have to edit or cut. You can just like get out the real truth out of people. So that's how I came up with the idea of having my own podcast. And I have this friend called Julien Neuville, who is the co-founder of Nouvelles Écoutes, who was also a big fan of American podcasts and had this obsession with Gimlet, this American studio. And so he told me, let's listen to Startup together and let's see if we are inspired by this. And we got inspired. So we were seeing that the podcast industry was really like nothing in France yet. And we thought we should go ahead now because it's probably going to bloom soon. And I guess we were right. Yeah.
You guys were right.
Cool. So my story is kind of different. I opened a blog 13 years ago about marketing. And I've always created content online, both on SlideShare, everywhere, giving conferences about marketing and stuff. But at some point I was looking for a new way to get attention, because there's so much content available for people, especially written and video. And you can't get attention when you do that, because there's so much content that people just like, they open a new tab and then they like start to read and then they pass to another one and they forget about it. So that's why I decided to open my podcast. It was like a bit later, like probably in May last year, so a year and a half. And then since my job is to help companies with strategy, I thought that it was also very useful for brand to create their own podcast. And actually, we've seen that before with the blog trend in the 2005. And brand did like whatever when they created their blogs. They were talking only about themselves. It was like quite lame. And so what we're trying to do with Plank is actually create interesting stories by brands. And what I've done is it's quite the same story. I had a client of mine, a former client of mine, who ran a studio since 30 years in France. So he's very much, he's a sound geek, really. He's been having 3 studios in Paris, so he's always been doing that his whole life. And so he helped me with my own podcast, and then we thought we could create that company together. helping brands going in the right way, right directions when creating content for the audience.
Now, I do want to get back to the question of how you were inspired. And you said you listened to American podcasts, but I do think it's interesting to see how this market kind of grew out of nothing, because there was nothing that you could base yourself off of, at least in this kind of style of independent production. And I do want to know why. What was the moment that made you think, I have to do podcasts. I have to get into this market. I think this is a really cool thing. Was there a show that you listened to that you thought was great, or a moment that you realized this is the perfect content format? You can start.
Well, I was really listening to a lot of stuff. I remember also listening to the podcast of Repeller, and which is this fashion blog. You probably know. People in France usually don't know it, but I'm sure you know it. And I don't know. It seemed like something that was. I was sure it was gonna break out. I cannot explain it. I don't know. I think also I had a feeling like as a journalist, I had spent my whole life writing about trends and be like, oh, this is going to be big, be careful. And I was like, let's not write about it. Let's do it this time. And let's jump into it, because that's something I can do as a journalist. But I was not expecting the success. I mean, I thought when I launched La Poudre, it was on fall 2016. And I remember like people were like, oh, a podcast. Cool. Like I was telling them I was gonna, make some goat cheese somewhere. Like I was like gone, like off the business. Like, okay, bye, Lauren. That's gonna be weird, but yeah. And actually, it really grew up really fast. And I think it was because the need was there. And I think it was also an answer to what Greg was describing very accurately. Like there is so much information, there is such a high rhythm of things we receive, things we have to read and like and share and click. And the podcast is excellently like, why don't you sit down for an hour and just listen to one thing? And that's how I sold it when it came out. And I think the message reached out easily because it was just obviously true.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. Actually, my approach is not that I was like listening to so many podcasts when I started. It's just that I've always written like very long format an analysis and not like a news. And I mean, that's my job to follow trends also somehow. So I was like, I'm sure people want to have like long information. They want to deep dive into subjects, but they don't get the time because we are in a snack content era. And so even when you read a book, you always have your phone next to you, and you take your phone. You can't like concentrate anymore. And that's really, that's the situation somehow because of social networks. And so since I knew the situation and I could, actually see myself doing it, I still wanted to create a long format and analysis. And so I started with a marketing podcast that's very accurate. And then my podcast transformed because I'm kind of bored with marketing. And it's not that I'm bored with marketing. It's more that I'm more into people. That always the reason why I've been doing marketing. And so my podcast transformed into the evolution of society within the industrial revolution that we are experiencing. So now I treat subject about, and I'm going to actually, I think, release an episode about masculinity next week, I think. But I also treated like ethic and porn. So very different subject, not only marketing really. But that was the same. I think that was the same idea at the beginning, like long format, giving the chance for people to take another time to experience it. And when you walk, you never really do listen to a podcast doing nothing. You always do something else, whether it's walking, gym, I don't know, whatever it is.
Excel spreadsheets.
Yeah, could be that.
Thing that everyone says.
Drawing.
Exactly. So you already do like two different things. You can listen to the content very accurately.
So speaking of trends, let's talk about the trends. So there are a few interesting things happening. I do want to get to the whole women in podcasting thing, but first I do want to talk about language. when you are starting your podcasts in French, I know, Lauren, you just released your podcast in English now. La Poudre is available in English.
3 episodes are dubbed.
Yeah.
That was a big job already.
Yeah. But I want to know, is there an interest for French producers to be producing in English as well? Is there this trend of having this kind of more internationalized podcast atmosphere for you guys in your productions?
Well, actually, these things, this happened to us when we didn't expect us, because one of our first clients was Chanel. So the podcast you mentioned earlier, we were like, it was really maybe out of the success of La Poudre that people in the fashion industry got like intrigued with what we were doing in the studio and thought like that would be cool to do this for us. So they trusted us with this adventure, which was really fun because we ended up dubbing podcasts in Russian, in Korean, in like, I don't know, 4 or 5 languages. And that was not something we were ready to do. And so when Chanel told us, like, is it okay to dub the thing in Russian? We're like, yeah, sure, no problem. How do we do that? So we ended up like casting actresses, Russian-speaking actresses and translators. And so we acquired this ability to dub the podcast, which enabled me later on to do this with La Poudre because we had acquired this ability. So I think it's always a surprise. I mean, we don't know what we're going to do like next week because the demands are like really growing. And so, yeah, we probably could be making a podcast in English for a brand or another institution soon this year, probably.
So I had the thing is, I used to live in the US, so I have the chance to have a lot of people that I know that are very interesting but don't speak French. And so I had Brand Moritz from Digiday on my podcast, and the statistics were like 0. And it's so interesting. I mean, if you know the guy, and I was like, wow, that's insane, because the guy is so interesting and people are not listening to him, even though I'm talking to marketers who are supposed to speak English and they don't listen to it. So I was like, it's too bad to have like such good speakers and not being able to release them, because French people will only listen to French. Somehow. So I decided to dub I only did 1 episode right now, but the masculinity one with Jerry from my boyfriend. It's gonna be in English, and I'm dubbing it tomorrow actually. So that's gonna be another one. But we already have a lot of demands of brands doing podcasts in English. So we do work with a lot of journalists, obviously, to have podcasts in English, and we're gonna work. I mean, it's not gonna be for French audience really. It's gonna be for the international audience. I guess that you not always, but if you have the choice, you will listen to our podcast that is in
your
own
native
languages.
language. Yeah.
I mean, if you have the choice.
I listen to a lot of French podcasts, but yes.
Yeah, but you're special.
Yeah.
No, but the interesting thing with the podcast is that when you drop your episode on iTunes or any other platform, it's all over the world instantly. And I'm always amazed to see listeners to our programs that are like French-speaking people but who live in New York or in Tokyo or in Moscow. And I think expats listen to a lot of podcasts because it's a nice way for them to stay in touch with the homeland. And so, yeah, I think anyway, the podcast, even if it's not in a different language, has a very international way of spreading itself, and that more than any other media, I think.
I mean, I've seen that with my own. One of the podcasts I work on is about expats, French expats coming back to France, and we have listeners around the world because that is they feel like they're listening to something from home, and they can be accompanied in their journey. And let's go into this kind of for brands. What is the trend of the formats that they like? The brands that you've been working on. I'm curious, just because some of the things coming out of the US are really fiction-based. There's a lot of audio theater and audio movies. But here it's different. Yeah.
As you said, there has been the first year, like let's call 2017, like the year 1 of podcasting in France. I think because the first podcasts that came out were conversational podcasts, many people thought it was maybe, not thought, but like just went into it because it was easy. The format was already here. The habits were already taken, but we're going towards more and more fiction formats, documentary formats, and I think the brands are like demanding of this kind of format right now. So yeah, in the next year, I think it's going to be much more diverse than that it has been until now in France. And you're going to hear fiction, you're going to hear documentary, you're going to have narratives, for sure.
Yeah. In at Plink we have a lot of still conversational, but also documentary, but we don't have fictional right now. Might come at some point. We didn't find any brands that was relevant for that, or maybe they didn't have that idea. They're still looking for ideas, so it's more about the studio to actually drive them to the
creative
right
direction kind of thing.
Yeah, because they don't really. What they know is they pay more and more money to have less and less attention because of the GAFA, Google and Facebook, basically. So that they know. They know also a lot of brands coming to say, oh, it's trendy, we want to do a podcast, which is always kind of boring, but it's how it's happening. And then we are trying to drive them to the right direction. We haven't found any brand for fictional, but I would love to do that, because that's the most interesting thing, I guess, to do fictional.
All right. So we've talked about brands, we talked about a little bit about formats. Let's get to the lady trend. Because
I'm the perfect person to talk about that.
No, I think it's fascinating to see how women have found their voice in podcasting here in France. It's something that you don't see in any other market, especially in the Anglophone market. I was just at this diversity in podcasting festival, and you see this kind of like blocage in French, where there's this barrier. You don't feel like you can start your project. There are other people who have, they know more than you, and people aren't as confident as they are here in France. You have journalists who have the experience to do this, and they're blocked. But here, it's a completely different story. And I want to talk about this trend. And Lauren, I know that you are maybe the perfect person to ask this, but what have you seen? I mean, do you kind of have a theory for this popularity? For is it out of a frustration that they couldn't do it in traditional media? At least that's my theory. What do you think?
I guess the podcast is a really efficient way of allowing, not how to use the right word, not oppressed, but like discriminated against people to speak up somewhere. I mean, there are a lot of feminine podcasts, but there is also a lot of podcasts made by Black community, because the medias in French are so male, so white, so straight, and like there is it's terrible. I mean, like you look at and you put the TV on, you can have a TV show with like 8 white male sitting around a table for 2 hours and talking to each other. I mean, like it's terrible. So I think most of the women who created podcasts are feminists, and there is a real political aim behind. That is my case, and I know that most of the podcasts you showed before have the same goal. So it's really to compensate something that's really wrong with the media in France, I think.
What do you think?
Actually, I wanted to receive Lauren on my podcast to talk about it.
Are you inviting me?
Yeah, I invited you already, but I did. But we didn't get the chance to meet really before. No, I've noticed the trend. It's a very interesting trend to see that most of the podcasts in France are actually led by women,
and even the studios. I mean, when you have the people who are higher up and VP co-founder positions, it's inspiring, and you don't feel as blocked as an independent to go into this field. So I think it's And
actually, I really agree with Lauren, and it's actually true also about the Black community. I think it's because, I mean, just what she said. I'm not going to repeat it. It's useless to repeat, but I think I agree. I mean, it's really to compensate somehow the media in France that are like really male and white, for sure.
And also, there is something easy in the podcast. I mean, like building a studio and running it as I'm doing today with Julien is it's not easy. we have 10 people working for us. Well, it's become a bit big, but at the very beginning, it was just me and my computer and a microphone I had gotten for 100 euros. I mean, it was something that was easy to start, and that's easier to put on a podcast online than to create a website or even a video. So there is also, I think, this accessibility that makes it easy for people who don't have many economical means to begin with to start their own thing.
And also, I think maybe I'm wrong, but what I've heard about women being entrepreneur, and I know a lot of them, it's always, I don't dare to do it. Maybe I'm not the right person to do it. And maybe with you will tell me, but maybe with podcasts, it's like, yeah, that's a thing that I could do, and I'm actually the right person to do it. And maybe that's also why it's actually moved that way.
Yes, probably. It's true.
Trying to turn the screen back on. It's a lovely background. Okay. Now that we've discussed the trends, I do want to get into a little bit of case studies. If you can discuss some of the projects that you have been working on, or if you must remain vague, because we all know what it's like to do marque blanche, which is, you can't name your brand that you've worked on. But if you could, talk about a little bit about the process. What is it like to create a branded podcast in France?
What is it like to create a brand?
A branded podcast.
A branded podcast. Well, what it used to be, because it has really changed, I think, in 2 years, was something maybe a little bit informal, with a brand like coming to you, like, I want to do this podcasting that looks cool, so tell me how to do it. Now it has become much more institutionalized because there are many communication agency and advertising agency who are in the middle of it. That's has starting to advise brands to make podcasts, and so they are like kind of an intermediary between the podcast studio and the brands, which is maybe not a great thing in my opinion, because making podcasts, I think, is a real métier.
But they're still looking. I mean, they're still searching for the place, because they're coming to us to explain them how the podcast is working. So I guess they're still looking for positions somehow.
Exactly.
So like, okay,
Exactly.
hi, we are Avas, we're WA or Publicis or whatever.
Exactly. Yeah.
They're like, I want to deep dive, but I don't know anything about
it. Exactly. That's it. So it's become much more competitive, because these agencies, they're gonna organize competition between the studios. It has really become much more stressful than it was 2 years ago when we started it. And more exciting too, because there is more money. And lately the contracts we won was because we were ambitious, and we proposed something that was big and different. And so it's also becoming really exciting on the other side. But we just hired someone to take care of this commercial part, Melanie, which is right here, because we couldn't handle it anymore. Just the two of us with Julien. We really need someone dedicated to these demands, and also someone who talks this language,
the marketing language.
Yes, exactly.
Which, of course, you're fluent in.
I'm quite used to it. So that's the easiest part for me, because, well, I know the brands already, they know me already, and I know how to talk to them. So that's the easiest part. And I guess the idea is, it's actually, I mean, that's again, I'm not going to repeat what she just said. They want to go into the, I mean, some of them are more interested about the attention that they can get, and some are more into the trend, like I want to get there. I don't know why, but I heard it was cool. Like every single trend in the digital sphere era. So that's kind of sad, but that's how it's happening. And again, I don't feel the pressure of competition so far. We're just trying to do whatever we can to help them. And what it looks like, really, it's more about doing a workshop, working with them about what the podcast should be like, and then really working with them so that we can build the best podcast for them. And then regarding production, I mean, my co-founder has been doing that for 30 years. So obviously he knows all the sound engineers. He has like a
network.
full list of journalists. Yeah, you have the full networks of everyone. So basically, that's, I guess, easier. And now we are going into the binaural sounds also, because I think that's for
left,
because
right.
because I mean binaural maybe, so that's 3D sounds basically. That could be useful for documentary, for example, but not for any kind of podcast, obviously. But we are going there also because I think that could bring something different for some brands. So we are, navigating with them somehow.
Going into it.
Yeah.
I'm curious actually to see, since it's all about positioning with these new studios. There aren't that many studios doing this in Paris and in France in general. I'm curious to see how you position yourselves, because a large part of creating branded podcasts is really kind of like this agency thing where you're giving a creative idea and then you're producing a final product. And Nouvelles Écoutes is kind of positioned as a media, but then you also do branded podcasts. And I'm curious to see what you think about this kind of separation. Do you feel like you have to identify as one or the other? Do clients even have this kind of questioning where they don't know, well, is this an agency? And like you said, when you're dealing with ad agencies who are trying to sell, how does that work?
Well, I think the fact that we're journalists and that we have because we only talked about La Poudre, but we produce, for example, Splash, which is an economic podcast that really works well. The host of Splash has a double page on Télérama that came out today. It's like, wow, huge star. Bouffon, a podcast about food. We have many like editorial podcasts already, and I think it gave an identity to Nouvelles Écoutes. I think people know what we're about. We're about, like, we have a certain vision of society and of humanity. We're trying to defend some values. And I think that's what the brands come to us for. I think they're interested in our like journalist view on society. So that's interesting because it's a bit schizophrenic. When I have to like inject my values and my feminism to a fashion brand, I mean, like there are some, but it works, and it's okay because we also like try and find what parts of the brands are important to us and what part of the identity want to make shine. So we try and come up with an idea that makes all these values really compatible, and I think what comes out is always quite unique in the end.
So obviously we have a different perspective because we don't have like editorial podcasts. We might do some at some point if we meet people that are very interesting and that we think it's relevant to do it. But we haven't done it so far. Beside my podcast. But our point is really about creating interesting content. And the thing is, brands have the money to do it, to really create good content, and it's our job then to help them to create the right content. I mean, not something that is brand focused, obviously, because that would be so boring. But
so it's more like an agency what you're doing. Would you position it like that?
It's more a studio because we produce everything also. So it's not an agency. But obviously I can do the agency. I mean, I've been head of social media for an agency it was Sapiens Razorfish. So I know the job like pretty well. So I can be the agency also. The only thing is when there are existing agencies coming up and with the big names, you also have agencies. But we have, for example, a car manufacturer that came to us. And so that's, car manufacturer, there's not so many. And there's no agency in the middle.
It's when you have a content director who's really interested in podcasts and they just come to you.
Exactly. You have someone in the team that is very interested in podcasts. But then the problem is that some of the people from the team, from the brands, they didn't even listen to a podcast ever. They didn't know what it looked like. They never searched for a podcast. They didn't know where to find them. They didn't know they have an app in the iPhone. So it's quite a challenge then to explain.
Okay, so open your phone.
Yeah, exactly.
Look for the app. It's already on your phone.
So no, it's not going to be a 30-second content, because they're like, oh, we can do 10 minutes. That's so much, because they are so used to hear from Instagram or Facebook or YouTube or whoever.
It's shorter.
Do shorter. If you have like 6 seconds of attention, that's amazing. And so when you tell them, oh, it's going to last for 30 minutes or an hour, they're like, what? I mean, people are gonna like fall down. And then we say, yeah, but it's not only about your brand. It's gonna be about people. It's gonna be a real story. And then it changed the perspective, I guess. And then they ask for the ROI. So why should brands should do the podcast, and what can we learn about it? And then we talk about non-directly financial return on investments, and how you can build a brand around their values. And that is the, I think, interesting part.
You're anticipating my next question and final question. I do want to know, and then this is for the International Podcast Day audience around the world. We have different people doing presentations like this to kind of discover different markets. And I do want to know, I mean, why should brands be investing in podcasting in France? What is the best part about podcasting in France? Give me your selling point.
Compared to other countries, or
yeah.
So, well, for there is a growing audience, that's for sure. And as you explained just before, we are used to listen to audio content, but also, and we discussed that when we prepare, when you look at the prices in the US compared to what we can invoice here. I mean, if you take Gimlet, they will invoice easily 80,000 euros for dollars for an episode, which we don't, because I don't exactly know what they invoice. I mean, you can have like different type of project, obviously, but to come up to $80,000 for one episode,
it's not the same thing here.
It's not the same thing. It's going to be way cheaper. That's I think a selling argument for international brand coming to France.
We're not cheap. I'm sorry, Gregory. No, I'm kidding.
I mean, we're not cheap, but we are cheaper.
There's also, I think, a very interesting international angle here, because as you said, you're producing in multiple languages, and you're already able to look at things from an international perspective because you are in the middle of Europe.
Totally.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah.
I think also there is great talents in France. I mean, like we've already been working with incredible music composers, our script writers, our actors or actresses. I mean, like I think there is a something about France that is good at producing culture and media and art. And I think there is not a surprise that it's blooming so much, the podcast right now, because it's really a big satisfaction for many people who have this savoir-faire. And also we're working with people who come from the movie industry, the advertising industry, but also with people from Radio France. And this is such an institution. I mean, like it's like probably the best radio school in the world. It's an incredible place that's unfortunately crumbling down slowly because it's a public service, you know. But that was very ironic. I hope you got it. And so yeah, I think we have really great talents in France, and we're just at the beginning of what we're going to be able to do. And I'm sure there's going to be like serials coming out of the French podcasts industry.
Yeah, I really think that I totally agree. I think we have a different way of storytelling. If you look at the novels or if you look at the movies, French movies, there's a different way of storytelling compared to the US, at least, for sure. And there are, I mean, if you look at the author that we have in France, we have that culture for sure of storytelling in a very profound way, I would say, very like specific.
Okay. Well, just to wrap it up, I do want to ask one question, and I think this will be fun because we can recommend podcasts to people. What are you listening to right now? What French podcast are you listening to? And let's leave people with that.
I'll start. I really listen to Think of You, that I love. It's a podcast that lasts for, each episode is about an hour and a half. At least, and it's about the evolution of society, but it's the angle is pretty much about the end of the world somehow. But they are interviewing like super interesting people, and so the podcast is just great. I listened to Entre nos lèvres that you just showed about love stories. I love that one. I listened to Pauline Legnaud, entrepreneur stories. I listen to La Poudre, obviously. many different podcasts. What I do now is when I see a specific episode that I really want to listen to, so I have a list that is pretty long. I also, only French podcasts. But yeah, those are the one I think I'm listening to the most.
It's horrible. Like I'm stuck. I'm like, wait. I have France Culture coming up, which is not podcast. So I'm bad. Yeah, I know. I guess I'm. Well, I like what Binge Audio just came up with Kif Taras, which is a conversation between two journalists, Rokhaya Diallo and Grassley, and it's a conversation about race. Which in France is like a big word, like wow, and the race is in the title, so woo. So I think it's brave and they're funny and clever. So I listened to the first episode like a few days ago, and I really enjoyed it. So I hope it grows and teaches people a bit more about this. And what else? I like to listen to Vlan. Actually, you know what? France Culture just produced this native podcast called Dans les Abysses.
Oh yeah,
which is not bad.
It's taking from the codes of the original one,
yes.
the podcast natif, and putting it back into radio, which is a fascinating new trend.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. It's really
they've only started this year to do that.
Yes.
So it's interesting.
So it's interesting. Yeah.
And I listened to La Poudre, Vlan. Entre nos lèvres, I actually listened to the pilot and I loved it. And I also listened to, there's so many. I have to be impartial. So thank you to the American University of Paris for hosting us this evening. And thank you all for attending. We are being joined by the journalism courses here at AUP. And thank you to my special guests.
If you, Lory.
You can follow us again by following at International Podcast Day on Twitter, and you can use the hashtag International Podcast Day France to continue to interact with us during the actual ceremony on Sunday. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, there you have it from France, and I really appreciate Lory Martinez, who is the moderator there, putting this together for all of us. It's really wonderful to really get a glimpse of what's going on with podcasting around the world. And as you can see there in France, there are different opportunities, different approaches than what we have in other countries per se, like we saw last hour in South Africa. And one of the hurting points to me is, here is a non-speaking nation that can speak English better than I. So I guess I really need to get on the bandwagon. I understand we had a little problem in the beginning of the episode where we did not get the intro in, but we will fix that for the future by turning Steve's head on the correct way to make things run correctly. So really looking forward to the next episode, which is one of our gold sponsors with Jessica Kufferman. And it should be a really great session. So thank you for joining us once again on this session of International Podcast Day. We have lots of content coming, hours of more of great stuff. Hang tough. We'll be right back after a brief break with more International Podcast Day 2018.